to another episode of Taxi Turbo. My name is Frank Gullo, and I am your host. On this episode, we're joined by Nicole Palsa, Nashville-based entertainment journalist, genealogist, and professional marketer. Nicole has spent more than 15 years covering the country music industry as a freelance journalist and brings over 2 decades of experience as a family historian. She's one of those people who lives at the intersection of storytelling and strategy, and she has a front row seat to how tech is reshaping both. Nicole, welcome to Taxi Turbo. It's so great to have you here. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, you've spent over 20 years as a communications professional across multiple industries, including not only music, but health insurance. And you've also simultaneously built like a separate freelance journalism career covering country music. And now you're running 2 Substack blogs, one on music and one on genealogy. So how did you end up like doing all of this, holding all of this, and how has tech enabled your success?
Well, I've always had multiple special interests, and technology has really allowed me to share those passions with a broader audience. So, my freelance journalism career has really been built on relationships. Every opportunity has been the result of a personal connection. Nashville's really a relationship kind of town. But once those doors open, technology has really allowed me to execute my work more effectively and connect to more people. On the genealogy side of things, it's always been a personal hobby, and I took technology to leverage that and make it available to more people. So before launching my genealogy Substack, I just had a research log and a family tree that I kept to myself. But as I started talking about some of my discoveries with my friends, they encouraged me to publish my findings. And so I was also inspired to write about my ancestors by a fellow genealogist named Amy Johnson Crow. She has a 52 ancestors in 52 weeks challenge that gives you writing prompts every week. And that also inspired me to start writing about my ancestors. So it's really helped me connect with people who share similar interests and even help me find some distant cousins.
Very cool. So you've been covering country music for well over a decade, which means through that time you watched streaming, social media, YouTube, now algorithmic playlisting reshape the entire industry. From your vantage point as a journalist and also someone in Nashville, what's the single biggest structural change tech has made to country music, how it gets made, distributed, and discovered ultimately?
Technology has really changed the gatekeepers for country music. More people can make and distribute music and discover music than ever before. So in years past, record labels and country radio programmers were often the be all end all when it came to whether or not an artist could be heard. Now there's more opportunities for musicians and listeners. So artists can record and release their music independently, and listeners can turn to streaming platforms and social media to find their favorite new artists. Playlisting and algorithms are the new gatekeepers for those platforms, but overall, music is much more accessible than it used to be.
Cool. So in researching, for this episode and country music, some what I'm hearing is that you kind of have these 2 groups now, audiences who or artists who've built audiences organically over many years, and now a new generation who's using new media like TikTok and other platforms. So as someone who covers the space, both people have been in the industry for a long time, and the newcomers, how is this playing out in country music? What are you seeing, and how is the industry changing?
Yeah, I think there's always been different segments of audiences. And even before, artists found success on TikTok, they were being discovered on YouTube. And before that, they were finding success on reality TV singing competitions as early as the 80s. Sawyer Brown was discovered on Star Search in 1983. So it goes back a long ways where these different segments of audience are being found, and artists they're launching their careers in different ways. And radio has always been a key gateway for music discovery over the years too. So there's always been those multiple avenues for artists to reach fans. And some artists who found success in earlier decades are embracing these new channels like social media, but others are, they prefer to stick to what they know. And they're still finding success that way because their audiences, they built them along the way and they know, how to find them. So I think really the tension that is happening now is with the responsibilities of an artist and how that's changed. So it used to be really focused on creating the music, performing the music, but now there's this other element to it where they're having to create this bite-sized content for the social media algorithms. And for some artists, it's a new creative outlet for them. But for other artists, it takes away from them being able to write music and perform. So I think that's where some of the rub is where artists feel like they're being pulled in more directions than they used to be.
I would say though, as a fan, some of it is really well done. So my daughter grew up; she likes Megan Maroney. Want to give a shout out? And, we saw Kenny Chesney, and some of that content is as good as short film, or right how it's woven together over many years. Do you think is that certain artists who have the budget, or is that just again the sensibility you're talking about?
I think it's a little bit of both. So I think artists like Kenny Chesney, Brad Paisley, their whole careers, they've had really good storytelling in video form well before social media. And so I think that's just evolved over time. So budget is definitely an aspect of it. But I think a lot of it has to do with the creativity of the artist and the team around them. It takes a lot of people to be able to put that together and execute it. So it's a lot of different factors for sure.
Cool. Okay, so I have a Gemini subscription, right? So there's always new AI features. And there was an email a few weeks ago, and we had already, booked this recording, and it was telling me that, I could also use Gemini in addition to generate text content images, music now. So it was giving some examples, and I think that's really interesting. So of course I've heard of AI generated music, and I know it's beginning to appear, and sometimes even imitating real voices. And I know there's that whole section. And covering this closely, what's the conversation in Nashville? We hear a lot about Hollywood, of course, but Nashville, what are they saying about AI creative ownership, and how are the artists and labels specifically thinking about it?
Yeah, there's a lot of concern around AI in the songwriting community in particular, making sure that songwriters are fairly compensated for their work and there's still artistic integrity, and that's kept intact. But there's also a really great example of how AI has helped an artist in an unexpected way. So Randy Travis, who's known for hits like Forever and Ever Amen, Three Wooden Crosses, he had a stroke in 2013 that left him unable to speak and unable to sing. But in 2024, he was able to release a brand new song called Where That Came From, thanks to AI. So, with his consent and with his oversight, his record label and his producer took samples from his previous recordings and overlaid them with vocals from an artist named James Dupre. And so, Randy's producer and engineer worked closely together along with Randy to fine tune that AI generated song. It was a proprietary model that the record label put together to make it sound as authentic as possible. So it wasn't just an AI output, there were humans involved throughout the process as well to make it to really deserve that artistic integrity that's true to Randy Travis. And so the result was a really beautiful way to extend Randy's career beyond what it could have because of his throat.
That's pretty cool. And on my list is got to check out some Randy Travis after this episode. So
Yes.
thank you for that. Okay, so for you as the journalist, I mean, your tools have changed dramatically. So you now have AI writing assistants, you have social listening platforms and tools, you have press kits, both physical and digital, you have streaming data. So what does your toolkit look like today? What do you use, and how do you draw the line between using tech, to really speed things up, work faster, but to keep your authentic human voice?
Yeah, to be honest, my toolkit's pretty limited. I'm kind of old school in a lot of ways when it comes to journalism. But I do use an AI powered transcription service, which is really helpful because transcribing audio can be a very time intensive task. I use video editing programs now that I'm getting more into content for social media. And I'll use, AI platforms to brainstorm sometimes, but I prefer quality over quantity. And so I'm not necessarily trying to crank out a bunch of stuff in really short time. And the process itself to me has a lot of value. The process of writing, the process of brainstorming and editing, thinking through concepts, tailoring messages to specific audiences, and really creating narratives. Um, and as far as, protecting my voice and my writing, um, something that I think about a lot is how any published work with my name on it ultimately impacts my personal brand and my professional identity. So it's really important for me to.
Absolutely. Okay, I want to switch it to talk about genealogy. And you've been a family historian for over 20 years, well before Ancestry.com, turned genealogy into a mainstream hobby. How has tech changed this work? What can you do now that was impossible a decade ago in genealogy?
So many things. So when I first started, I was a youngster and I was definitely not the norm. Genealogy as a hobby is traditionally more of a senior citizen hobby, and I definitely started young. So when I started it, I was going to a lot of libraries, archives, different repositories like that to get access to records. And what technology has done is made those records more accessible. So the volume of digitized records has expanded exponentially over the last decade. So sites like Ancestry.com, they're now enormous record aggregators they're improving access around the world. Cost is still, unfortunately, it prohibits a lot of people from getting into it, but it takes money to be able to preserve those records. So there's a balance between those things. One of the biggest breakthroughs that I've seen recently is AI powered full text search capabilities, which can search both printed and handwritten documents. So, for example, it found my ancestor's name that was written sideways on a document from the 1700s. So, that survey record, the original record, had only been indexed by the original owner that was listed. So, my ancestor's name would have never shown up in an index search. But now, this new full text search capability looks at every single word on an image, and it's just opening so many possibilities and helping people break through those brick walls of their family history research.
On that note, I want to take a moment, Nicole, to thank you. I commissioned you previously to craft a piece about my late uncle, Chucky, knowing that it would entail a lot of research and expertise in genealogy as well as technology. And, I knew that you had the skill set to do it, but what you came back with, I was impressed because it was more than the records. It was more than the research. It was more than what you found. It was a story that you were piecing together. And I can see that the tech in the space is allowing it so much more. But I also, I hear different stories. I hear that it's great, and I hear people who may want to use it differently in different cultures. So from your perspective, when you're researching or when people reach out to you, what do you um, have to do to reconstruct a life and bring a story together? How does that process work?
No, if you're building an entire life story from fragments, it's sort of like working with a puzzle. So you start with what you already know, you find those edge pieces and you lay those out, and then you work your way towards the middle. So the edges are usually the basic facts like birth, marriage, death dates, that sort of thing. And the time period and the location are really key because that's going to determine what resources or records are available to you. So, in the case of your late uncle, oral history was really key to telling his story because there were people who were still living who knew him. And so I was able to get information from those folks to really fill out the story. So if I had only looked at, a birth record or, a school record or something like that, or even a newspaper article, it really would have limited what I could have put together. So the technology allowed me to find those records, like those newspaper articles from different states and government records about his military service. Having conversations with people who knew him really allowed me to capture, his personality and who he was. And that's one of the reasons I encourage people to interview their family members, especially their oldest living relatives. They can add color to the lives of your ancestors and give you information you're not going to find anywhere else. And, once those older relatives pass away, their knowledge goes with them. And so we have the opportunity to preserve their memories for future generations.
Interesting. And on that note, DNA testing has become a very powerful genealogical tool available, but also something very complex. People at times are discovering things about relatives, family secrets, and more. So, as someone who's been doing this for a long time, what do you think about the ethics of this kind of research? I've also heard about cloning pets, right? So, this is a very broad subject. So, where do you land, and what are you seeing that people are thinking in this space?
I think these platforms are starting to recognize the really profound psychological impact these discoveries can have. And I do think they have a responsibility to users to help them navigate this type of research. I hope they'll start publishing more, disclaimers, offer more guidance and training about how to not only process the information they receive, but also how to cautiously communicate with other users. There's a TV show that I've been watching recently called Long Lost Family that's based in the UK, and they reunite adoptees with their birth families, and they use a social worker. And it's really important to cautiously navigate that because there's so many elements in these types of discoveries that can be really traumatic for everyone involved. And so I think that it's amazing what the technology is doing. It's helped me personally in solving some mysteries in my own family. I've also uncovered things in other people's families unintentionally, and I've had to be very cautious about, do I reach out to them? Do I not reach out to them? Um, it's a very tricky thing to navigate, but I think that these DNA companies do have a responsibility to be able to help people navigate that.
Absolutely. And, back to tech, this podcast security, genealogical databases now hold some of the most sensitive PII in the history of data, right? So, there was the 23andMe, story. So, from this perspective, how should people be thinking about what they're consenting to when they upload a DNA sample, independent of the other topics?
I think one of the most important things is to understand, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish by doing DNA testing? Because there are several different companies and they offer different types of services. So, for example, you talked about 23andMe. There's a lot of health information in that platform as opposed to some other platforms. And so if you're not looking for that health information, that may not be the service that you want to use. So if you're looking for more genealogical, ethnicity breakdowns, that type of thing, another company might be a better fit for you. And the biggest thing is to really research the companies that you're going to be submitting your information to, understand their terms of use, how they use their data. There's a common misconception that law enforcement agencies can use public database like Ancestry for criminal prosecution, and that's just not true. So you really have to dig into each company, do a lot of research because your DNA data has a tremendous amount of value and there is a risk involved with that. And so you have to understand what your personal risk assessment is and evaluate those companies before you do that.
Thank you very much. Great insight and perspective. And we'll have links to both of your Substacks, the Kinfolks and Country Music, in the notes. And like speaking to a journalist from Nashville, I want to get back to country music to wind us down. So I want to talk, since 2016, you volunteered with an organization, Musicians on Call, at the Nashville VA Hospital, walking musicians in to perform bedside for veterans. That's a very human experience in the middle of what is, for most of us, a very digitized relationship with music nowadays. So, what does this mean to you personally? And what have you seen it do for people receiving this?
It's one of my favorite things to do. Out of everything all my hobbies, passions, it's my favorite thing to do. It is such an honor to bring the healing power of music to veteran patients, their families, and even the medical staff there at the hospital. When we walk into a patient's room, we never know what kind of situation that person may be in. And the combination of a live music experience and caring volunteers really help people. Um, every time I volunteer, I always hear feedback from patients about how grateful they are that we spent time with them and brought a little light to their day. And I've witnessed some incredibly moving moments over the years. And one that stands out is when we visit a patient who was near the end of his life. He wasn't alert or responsive, but his daughter asked us to come in and perform for him. And as soon as the music started, he immediately reacted with a smile on his face and began using his hands to move to the music. It brought his daughter to tears, and she FaceTimed her family so they could see his extraordinary reaction. And that's why we say that music heals. That's one of the mottos of Musicians on Call, because we see it every time we go into a hospital. And I also volunteer as a host for their live virtual programs for pediatric hospitals across the country. And even though those programs are less interactive, they still give patients a chance to take, a mental break from whatever they're going through and help make their day a little bit brighter.
That's very cool. Thank you for sharing that. Related, there's growing research on music therapy, measurable effects on pain, anxiety, cognition. You've witnessed this firsthand at the VA and you cover the music industry as well. So these feel like different relationships with what music does to people. Does the industry understand and feel this? Does the commerce complicate it? How do you see these things coming together?
Anyone who's experienced live music understands how profoundly it can impact people. But because the music industry covers such a broad spectrum of roles, you'll find a lot of people that are seeking the more quantitative results instead of qualitative value. But in order for the songwriters and performers who create that music to be paid, there has to be a level of commercial success. But I do think that defining an artist's success solely by the commercial strength of it is too narrow of a scope. A lot of times when I'm talking to artists about the moments that impact them, it's the stories they hear from fans about how a song has changed their life. And that can motivate an artist, beyond a chart topping hit.
So Nicole, you mentioned both of your Substacks, and I know you have some other appearances as well. You mentioned to me. So, what are you planning for the rest of the spring and the rest of the year? What else is on your calendar?
Yeah, so I recently recorded a podcast called Stories That Live in Us with Krista Cowan, who's the chief genealogist at Ancestry.com. And that series is actually walking through spotlight stories from each state in celebration of the 250th anniversary of America. So my story is around Virginia, where my family is from. So you'll get to hear a little bit about my family's history on that. And in the country music space, we are in full swing with events. So the Academy of Country Music Awards is in May. CMA Fest is here in Nashville in June, and all the wheels are rolling. Lots going on.
That's awesome to hear. Okay, in closing, I asked an AI assistant, to analyze your background and generate a closing question. Let's see what it came up with. Nicole, you've spent your career as a storyteller across 3 distinct domains: music journalism, corporate communications, and genealogy. And you've watched technology transform all 3. If you had to identify the one thing that technology consistently cannot replace or cannot replicate in any of these fields, what would it be? And what responsibility do human writers, journalists, and researchers have to protect that as AI gets better and better at imitating us?
For me, it's 2 things. It's empathy and compassion. I can prepare for an interview, plan a communication strategy, and develop a research plan using technology, but it doesn't replace that gut check that I do in the moment. We have to protect the human spirit by cultivating emotional intelligence and critical thinking skills.
Nicole, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. Where can people find you and follow you along?
Sure. You can follow my work in country music on Substack, Facebook, and Instagram under the name Amplify Country. And if you want to dig into your roots, you can follow Ken Folks on Substack. And then I'm also on LinkedIn.
All right. Nicole, thanks so much for coming on.